Hello and welcome back to Pete's Garage, where it's been a long time since I posted a video, and this vehicle right here is a 1993 Fox Body Ford Mustang. A gentleman contacted me about installing a Terminator X system onto a Fox Body Mustang that he just won in a Facebook raffle or whatever he called it. And this is the vehicle that he won. So we're going to go ahead and install a Holley EFI system on it. So a little background on the car. This is a 1993 Ford Mustang notchback. This is a very nice example of a Fox Body that hasn't been completely molested over the years. However, this one, it is not stock. It is far from stock. In fact, that the engine is actually a 331 stroker. You can see we have trick flow intake. It does have Edelbrock Performer aluminum cylinder heads on it and a Vortec supercharger, a V1, looks like a Vortec V1. I have no idea how much boost it's going to put out, but I guess we will find out. And these are mass airflow cars from the factory, so we're going to be running it in speed density with the Holley system. Things I need to consider whenever I am doing this install. I definitely want to keep the streetability of this car, so therefore we need to make sure that the air conditioner is still going to work. Also, I need to make sure that the instrument cluster is going to work properly. So we need to make sure we hook up the gauges correctly. And I also want to make it to where whenever we are hooking up under the dash to where the factory ECM got its power and ground and a couple other signals and everything, where it interfaces with the rest of the vehicle, that I am going to pin out a connector that's easy to disconnect to where it's not hardwired into the vehicle. So just a couple little things, you know, here and there makes for a much better swap, right? Not just a complete standalone. We want to try to integrate our standalone ECU as well as I can into the stock body of the vehicle. So you have some options as far as instrument clusters and instrumentation whenever you are doing something like this install. In fact, in this case, he's actually going to keep his stock cluster. However, we do have an aftermarket boost gauge, and it looks like an aftermarket water temp gauge. I don't know if the gauge on the dash doesn't work or what exactly is going on there. I'm going to actually test that and see exactly what's going on with that gauge. So I guess without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so one of the first things you need to do before you actually take everything apart to install your EFI system, I suggest getting a timing light out, because you're going to need one anyway, because this thing has a distributor. It's not like an LS engine that doesn't have a distributor in it, or a newer Coyote. So you need to know what the base ignition timing is before you do anything, so you can input it into the Holley system. So before we ever take it apart, while it's still running, I'm going to go ahead and check and see exactly what the ignition timing is, so I know in order to record it and put it into the ECM on the new Holley setup. Now, on these older Ford style, the computer did control the timing after, you know, what was different than the base timing. So in order to check the timing, I need to disconnect the spout connector, which stands for spark output or spark out, and I need to remove this. When you remove this little chip right here, this little connector, it puts it in base timing mode. And then I will look down at the crankshaft balancer with my timing light while it is running, and I will see what the base ignition timing is. So now I need to start it up and check it out. like we have a base timing of 12 degrees and the idle timing was at 22 degrees before top dead center. So we need to record that so we know where to start with our new timing table. Was that a necessary step? Not 100%, but it will really help us out whenever we are trying to dial in our initial timing settings. We'll probably change them and everything, but we at least know where that distributor is set if we don't even remove it, which we shouldn't have to, unless we need to go digging into the lower intake for anything, you know. But at least we now know where the base timing is. So that's going to help us out on the back end after we get everything hooked up and we try to start it for the first time, because who knows, it probably is not going to be easy to get to start on a random fuel table that we just make up, or a timing table that we're just going to have to make up unless we're just really good and can nail it. But we at least have a good starting point. We know the thing idles at 22 degrees and it idles pretty good at 22 degrees of ignition timing. So that's a good place to start. So that is the first tip. That will really make your life a lot easier, having that knowledge whenever we go ahead and hook up the EFI system. So without further ado, let's get moving along. Okay, now if you're working on a Fox body installing this EFI system here, you do have to access the fuel injector connectors to be able to put on the fuel injector harness and everything. Also, the manifold air temperature sensor that you have to swap out that comes with the Holley kit goes right here. And if it has a factory style intake, it's going to cover up this side pretty bad, and the throttle body covers up that side. So it is easier to just pull the upper intake. In this case, I actually need to reseal the lower intake because I got a coolant leak coming from the intake manifold gasket there. It's got Edelbrock heads and a trick flow intake, so I got to see what kind of gaskets I even need to get for this thing. But this also gives you opportunity. So the coolant temp sensor that comes in the Holley kit goes right here. Manifold air temp goes right here. And then our harness for the fuel injectors also goes in here. Now the harness for the fuel injectors is a separate harness from the part that has the manifold air temperature in it. So it's a little different the way the breakout is and everything on that. So it's going to be kind of like right here where it's got two different harnesses that run this side, because also the distributor harness also goes right there for the ignition system. So all this stuff's going to have to go. This is way easier to route it with the upper intake off than trying to do it with it on. So we got to get the old harness out. Barely hanging on by a thread on the old original harness's ground. Wow. Makes you wonder how many faults that nobody even noticed that you're actually going to fix by putting a new harness in it. Because this ground is not very good right now. It is barely hanging on. So yeah, here's the ground that was on the cylinder head. And I'd say probably half of the strands aren't even there doing their job, although there's still quite a few. But that could induce a voltage drop. So this sensor up here on the firewall is the barometric pressure sensor. So the Holley uses the map sensor as the barometric pressure sensor. So we're going to do away with that. And I'm actually going to install a 3-bar map sensor in its place when it gets here, because the Holley is speed density. And let's see, that harness runs around the brake booster. And that's right, it ties up into up here for power and everything. So there's also another connector, I believe, in this circuit right around there that I'm going to have to play with. So over here on the fender, you have your ignition coil. So this piece of the harness right here comes around the back side of the intake, and I think it usually goes over the brake booster, but it might go under the brake booster on everything. And that's where the harness gets its power from this solenoid. All right, and then it also breaks off and it comes down here. I believe it also connects to a ground. And also it connects to a harness right here. And this connector right here is the one that runs over to our AC compressor. So the wiring for the air conditioning is embedded into the wiring harness that I'm going to end up having to strip the AC wiring out and run it with the new harness. So let me disconnect all these powers and everything and get the harness as loose as I can. Make sure you disconnect your negative battery cable before you start all this. So this solenoid over here, the starter solenoid, also is basically a power distribution block on these old Fords. So instead of having a big fuse block under the hood here, they just get power from right here. And that runs power to the ECU. Okay, that part of the harness now can get pulled through. There's another connector under here too. And I think this connector is what connects all the gauges. Okay, so down here by the brake booster, there is this plug right here that has, what is it, 6 wires in it? And it looks like 8 wires going in it. Now this is the interface that goes between like your ignition switch and the rest of the car out here, I believe. And it also, I think, is your sensors for like coolant temp and your oil pressure that goes to the dash. So we are going to have to retain this and hook up the wires and everything so our dash works properly. The old EEC3 or whatever this is, diagnostic tester comes with it, and then also our ignition coil connector right there. I think we're going to have to rob some of that also. But at this point I can pull the harness out that way, and it's amazing how much cleaner it gets when there's no harness in there, but we do have to put the Holley harness in, so it's not going to be completely empty, but the Holley harness is a little bit cleaner, I think. Yeah, so a bunch of the stuff in this branch we will have to retain, mainly because it does have the AC wires, the ignition coil power, and those other sensor wires. Okay, fuel injectors. In order to properly tune any kind of EFI system, you have to know exactly what the fuel injectors can spray in pounds per hour or cc's per minute. But there's also more data to it than that because this is a solenoid and is mechanical. So there is a difference in time between when the electricity flows through the coil of the injector and when it can actually move the pintle. There's also a problem when you have really low pulse widths. Like say you try to pulse this at say 0.5 milliseconds or half a millisecond. Then you may run into a problem where it's such a quick movement that it doesn't actually open the injector. So there's a minimum pulse width, and there's short pulse adders and other kind of information that goes with these. Now, the question is, how do we know what these injectors even are? So I'm going to flow check all of them and make sure they're all the same, see what kind of information I need to put into the Holley. Since I got the intake manifold off, the lower intake gaskets were leaking coolant right out the front there from that coolant passage. So I got to wait on the intake gaskets to get here from Summit Racing. I figured I'll go ahead and get going on the rest of our harness here. The rest of the harness, the part that was with the intake manifold, that was where the salt and pepper shakers, those connectors at the back of a stock intake are. And this harness and everything right here, that does end up going to, it looks like the coolant temp sensor there. All right, so then this harness comes all the way up here, and part of it also is the AC pressure sensor that goes for the low side pressure switch. There we go. I'm going to have to take this piece out of the harness, and then it also branches up here to the fuel pump relay in the front. So I am going to have to take apart quite a bit of this harness and pillage some of this stuff to make this work. Now, I could just throw in the Holley harness, but I would then lose a bunch of the functionality on things like gauges and the AC and all this other stuff that we really want to keep on this vehicle. So you don't just go cutting this harness and throwing things away, because we are going to need pieces out of this to make this work. Right up here on this inner fender, there's some wiring that runs right here. Now, there are a couple of relays. Now, it depends on what year you have. Most of them are going to have an AC shutoff relay for when you go wide open throttle. And then I believe 91 through 93 are going to have the fuel pump relay up under here versus under the driver's seat. And the AC shutoff relay right here, I'm going to use one of the outputs in the Holley whenever we go wide open throttle. That'll trigger this relay to cut off the AC compressor once the AC is up and going. Now, if you have a 91 to 93, I believe you will have airbags. And there are two other connectors that are down here. They're kind of hard to see. They're two wire connectors that are part of this harness. And these are for the crash sensors on the front of the car. There's one behind the passenger headlight and one in the front middle. And those two connectors have to be unplugged, yet they're part of this same harness. So as stuff that I'm going to take out of this harness, I'm going to have to take a lot of this stuff out and reuse it. So at this point, I pretty much have the harness loose, and I'll be able to pull it through the firewall. There is a grommet right back here in the firewall that Holley says to reuse. It even had a bunch of connectors that aren't even connected now. I'm not quite sure. Oh, those are all emission stuff. I think for secondary air injection and EGR possibly. Yeah, I can't remember, but it's not hooked up on this vehicle. So I'll be able to get that harness pulled out. I got to go inside the car now to where the factory EC3 is, the ECM, and unplug it and pull it through to remove the harness and everything. So that's our next step. All right, so let's head to the inside of the car where the factory ECU is. And there it is. There's our factory EC3 ECU. Now this one was tuned with some kind of chip, like back in the day they used to do on these Ford 5 liters. I mean, these are like the original American tuner car, because you could actually tune these. But you'd have to get like a J9 or a J3 chip or something like that. And you can see it's got something wired into the ECU right there. And it runs up to the glove box and all that. We're going to have to remove all that wiring. But there are a few other connectors in here that we do have to deal with as far as our swap. Some of them we will need, some of them we will leave, some of them we don't. We'll have to see which ones are which. And I need to disconnect the 10mm that's down there, disconnect the connector, and slide out the ECU. Let's see if my trusty little mini screw gun here can get that off. Okay, there it goes. There's also a ground right here, which is the main ECU ground. This little 7mm or 8mm down there. Can I get the ECU out without pulling that? Yeah. Okay. So a lot of these, yep, there's the chip. I guess this is an EEC4. I kept calling it EEC3 earlier, so this is an EEC4 ECU. And you can see right here, you got this little chip right there in the J3 port, is that what it's called? Or J9? I can't remember exactly what it's called. I think J3 port. And that is the chip that they'll run off of a map instead of the one that's programmed into the actual ECM. Yep. All right, so this chip just slides out and slides onto these pins right that are in here. All right, so we had these pins on a connector. This piece right here, this header, slides right over that, and there's a connector right here to interface with this thing in order to program it. Super Chips is copyright 2004 that's on that thing. So this thing's still over 20 years old. But you know, it's still running the car, but we got stuff that's better than this nowadays. You can see we got quite a few connectors under here. This connector right here is just a body harness connector that's going to stay. I am going to disconnect it just to make my life a little easier, but it's going to get reconnected at the end. However, this part of the ECU's harness does have at least 2 connectors right here that do interface with the rest of the car. So we're going to have to either reuse those connectors or switch them out for a different style connector. This connector looks like it's going to stay, and that one's going to stay. Okay. So a little tip. When you are trying to pull this harness out, you're not going to be able to get the harness out until you take the factory bracket for the factory engine control module, or ECU, out. Which that's fine. There is a 7mm screw that holds the bracket at the very top of it. I can't even get my camera in there on the inside, and you just have to slowly wrench it out by hand with a ratchet wrench and everything like that. So I'm going to get under there and I'm going to do that. Take me about 20 minutes, probably standing on my head to get it. But once it's out, then I should be able to get this harness out. All right, so this is the bracket that holds the factory ECU in, and the wiring harness runs right past it. So if you don't take this bracket out, it will get stuck on the connectors and everything that we're trying to pull through the firewall. So you have to take this plastic bracket out. And the only thing that's holding it in is this little 7mm right here. But the HVAC case is right here. You can barely get your hand up in there to get it out. And since we're not reusing it or anything, if you open up the glove box and you stick a pry bar way through here and hit it with a hammer, you can bust all this off, and then you can get your hand up in there and actually get this 7mm screw out. If not, it is a nightmare to try to get out. I just spent a long time trying to get it out till I decided I was just going to go ahead and break that thing off. So, little tip. And now can we pull the harness? There it goes. All right, so this is the factory ECU connector, and this is the big wire that was in the glove box. And it's got, I don't know, what, 12 circuits or something, tiny little wires in there. And it went to a PLX, I'm pretty sure it was a data logger, an old school data logger. And this is tied into a whole bunch of these circuits that go to the actual factory ECU. And I'm pretty sure it was trying to take coolant temp, mass airflow voltage. They compared that to wideband, air fuel ratio, power ground, 5 volts, all that sort of stuff. Manifold air temp, ignition timing, all that, so they could data log it back. That's what they had to do back in the day, because trying to data log through the factory ECU and everything was pretty difficult. Technology has come a long ways, and that's one of the reasons why we use things like this standalone ECU like the Holley, is because we can data log real easily straight to the laptop and everything. And we can look at all this data in real time and not have to have expensive data loggers because it comes with it. and the wideband is integrated, whereas the wideband had to be standalone just for tuning purposes, and then you put it back into closed loop. Lots of things that, you know, back in the day, you know, 25 years ago, that they had to do to try to get something like this tuned in. You know, we got bigger displacement engine, boost, all the same stuff we do nowadays. It's just, we got it easy nowadays, honestly. Especially if it's like a factory ECU and you can use something like HP tuners. But for the older stuff, converting it over to some of these standalones, modern day standalones, are pretty cool. We do have this grommet right here that Holley wants us to cut and reuse. I have a 3D printer, and I think I'm going to measure this, and I might print one out of TPU that probably fits a little bit better, because if I remember correctly, the Holley harness doesn't quite fit this quite right. So I'm going to see if I can print my own grommet that mimics this same shape and everything, that's a little more forgiving. So anytime you're taking apart an old harness, be ready. This tape is going to just have nasty goo, and it's going to get stuck on everything. Holley wants us to cut this grommet so we can reuse it. Try not to cut myself in the process. So here is that grommet that we can use with the Holley system. Okay, so this gentleman is actually, he's got a few of these Fox Body Mustangs. And this, he's had this for a while. I think he's had it for quite a few years. This is the Holley Terminator X kit that was designed for the Fox Body Mustang. I don't think Holley, last time I did one a couple years ago, or maybe it was a little over a year ago, Holley no longer had a Fox Body specific kit. It was just a Ford specific kit, not Fox Body specific. However, I think about the only difference is the Fox Body specific kit, they gave you this bracket, right? So this bracket is designed to mount the ECU for the Terminator X underneath the passenger side seat. So it's a nice little bracket. I think you can still buy the bracket separate, it just doesn't come with this kit. Okay, what else makes this a specific Fox Body style kit? Well, let's see here. The injector harness. All right. So the injector harness right here, it is numbered in Ford style, right? So where bank 1 on the passenger side goes back 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the driver's side front to back is 5, 6, 7, 8. So the harness for the injector harness is pinned out for Ford, right? Because if it was GM, it'd be alternating, and so would Dodge. Back and forth starting with the driver's side if it was like an LS or a small block Chevy. So the harness is Ford specific. However, the Ford one that you get is just like this. So it's not Fox Body specific necessarily. Okay, what else? We have this harness right here. This is the ignition harness, right? So this harness goes to the Ford TFI distributor, and that then hooks into the Holley ignition harness connector. All right. If it was an LS, I believe this would connect, and you would then have all the ignition coils on there. All right. So this is Ford specific, that connector right there. All right. Also, this comes with the Ford small block kit that you can buy from Holley. This harness is pinned out with a couple other sensors, oil pressure sensor and fuel pressure sensor. The oil pressure sensor for a Ford is way down there on the bottom left side of the engine. you'd have to get a separate sensor and everything, just the same as you will for the fuel pressure. It does not come in the kit. There is no fuel pressure sensor already on the engine, so you have to buy either the Holley or some other brand. This one right here is from Low Dollar Motorsports. They're not sponsored or anything. It's just a little bit cheaper sensor, 0 to 100 PSI sensor. You could use the same pressure sensor for the oil pressure as you do fuel pressure. Just buy 2 of them. Honestly, it has an oil pressure gauge on the dash. I'm not going to run a oil pressure sensor. However, we are going to run a fuel pressure sensor because it is supercharged. Anytime you're running boost, you definitely want to know what your fuel pressure is, and you don't want it to run lean. So therefore, we can put some safeties in there to set a rev limiter at a certain amount if the fuel pressure dips and all that. This one is kind of nice because it's already the correct connector. So fuel pressure, it should just plug right in. Boom. Right? So the sensor already plugs in, but I am going to probably remove this oil pressure sensor wiring just so I don't have the sensor dangling around that we don't really need. In this harness right here, we have a few things. You have a new fuel pump relay. It comes with its own fuel pump relay. You have to wire the output, the green wire of this relay, to the fuel pump power wire that was originally on the car. We have our switched 12 volt power. This one right here, I believe, is going to go to one of those connectors that was also right there by the ECU, and a chassis ground. So this right here is going to go where the ground was on the factory ECU. So I'll just put a little eyelet terminal on there, boom, ground. Now there is the main power cables. This main power harness that goes for the ECU and everything. This thing right here has to go to the battery, right? This runs to the battery, and it is also going to have to run through the grommet along with this harness. Here's the main chunk of wiring that comes through the firewall right there, right? So it's a pretty decent chunk of wires, and it pretty much takes up the entire inside of this grommet, right? And if we have to also run this harness through there, it's going to be pretty tight. So that's why I think I'm going to print up my own grommet out of TPU on the 3D printer. It'll be kind of fun little test to see my skills on the 3D printing. And I'm going to go from there on that, and hopefully I'll just make it a little bit bigger to where this will be able to go through. Yeah, be a nice little custom addition to the car. So if you're looking at the ignition wiring and you're kind of confused, and the Ford stuff is a little bit confusing, right? So you get this TFI wiring harness right here that plugs in to the ignition. And remember, when we took apart the original harness, this little connector right here that goes to the factory ignition coil. There is no ignition coil wiring that comes with the Holley kit. Well, somehow we have to trigger the ignition coil. So we need to reuse this connector, right? The red wire needs to go to some sort of 12 volt ignition powered wire. It is a red and green wire, and there is a red and green wire on this connector that was underneath the brake booster. So I do think maybe that's where we're gonna be getting that from. It comes from the ignition switch, I believe. And for the other side, so that's just the power wire right there. The other side is this brown and yellow wire. And that's what this white wire that comes off of this harness from the TFI ignition harness is the trigger wire to trigger the coil, which is going to be the yellow and brown wire. So I'll show you whenever I get to hooking that up. And I got to strip this harness of the stuff that we need out of it. So I have a lot of the factory harness, all the conduit taken off of a lot of it. I still have a little bit over by the ECU connectors that I am going to have to probably peel back, but here's the gist of what I got going on. All right, this right here is the trunk of wiring that runs up by the mass airflow sensor. This is the mass airflow sensor connector. It's going away, so that stuff right there Boom, it's taken out of the branch of wiring. It's gone. This branch right here is oxygen sensors. So this piece also going away. These right here, we have our AC unloader relay. This turns off the AC compressor at wide open throttle. I need to keep this, all right, because this has a lot of the AC compressor circuit stuff in it. It also goes to this connector right here that goes to the AC pressure switch, the low side cycling switch on the AC. So you can see this kind of pinkish wire right here in blue stripe also goes, well, up to that relay. We've got a couple other wires that are signal wires to the ECU there that turn on whenever, or tell it whenever the AC turns on. So we can use that as an input to the Holley so it knows when the AC is on to kick the idle up a little bit. All right, so I do need to pick these circuits out of this harness. Also, we have these two smaller connectors right here need to come out of this harness because these are for the airbag system. So these are also going to run through over to, I think it might be this connector right here where a couple of the wires did get cut as we pulled it through the firewall. Because it was so sharp, I do need to repair those wires. So that connector right there by the ECM is these circuits right here. So I need to pull those out of there because I need to reuse those. The other relay right here is the fuel pump relay. We don't need this relay anymore. The Holley has its own relay. However, we need to find where that wire goes. I think it's this green with yellow wire right there. And I believe it also runs to this green connector. So I can hook the Holley up to this green connector and then it will supply power to the fuel pump whenever we need that. But these three things I do need to keep. And so I need to pick them out of this harness. Also, this relay that was sitting on top of that crappy plastic bracket that holds the factory ECU in, this is the main power relay for the ECU. It does have a trigger wire that is red with a green stripe that powers up the ECU whenever you're in cranking and in ignition voltage. So you need to make sure the power source you pick to trigger the Holley to turn on is turned on even in crank. That's what that red and green wire is that triggers this relay. The problem is, where does that get its actual power from? Right? You would think it would probably be close over here to one of these connectors because it's got to come from the ignition switch. However, this is on the passenger side floorboard, right? The ignition switch is on the steering column. Well, I believe if we trace this wire, it's going to run all the way across this harness, and now we're back to the stuff that was over by the brake booster. So this whole harness, this is why I had to pick it all the way apart. Now we're over here by the stuff by the brake booster. That little Canon 8-pin Canon connector, it has the red and green wire in it. There's the red and green wire. This is the main power wire that's going to trigger our Holley to turn on. It splices right here. Another part that it goes off of that splice is to our ignition coil power. So it powers the ignition coil while you're in run and crank, like I was saying, same as the Holley, right? And that's how we get that. Also, I believe the trigger wire that we need to connect that white wire on this Holley TFI connection to for the negative coil connection also goes right here, and this supplies our tachometer right there to make our tachometer on the dash work. That's why these are all spliced together. So we need these connectors right here. Also, the AC wiring that's part of this is in here. Here's our AC wiring and that ground that I just disconnected over by the starter solenoid. That's the ground for the AC compressor, among other things. There's also a few more circuits that I got to figure out that are for the oil pressure and for the coolant temperature that also go to this connector right here. So those are those typically connect to these salt and pepper shaker connectors. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, remember I was saying our airbag connections and everything. Look at that. It was all integrated into the harness. Once I finally got it all out, it's its own separate little harness that was integrated with that. Now we can still retain our airbag function and everything on the functionality on the car. So I had to get that out of the harness, and that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm just picking out the little things that I need to keep. So it's not as simple as just plug and play your Holley harness if you want to retain all these other functions. Okay, on the Holley harness, there's some loose wires. All right, you got these two, there's a red and a white wire. Now the white wire says that it is a points output. So that would be an output to an ignition coil or a CDI box or something like that, but it is not used in this application. So I will remove it from the harness. The other one is 12 volt battery power. So this should be constant 12 volts. Now it doesn't necessarily have to go directly to the battery like it does on the main power wire. So I can pull that 12 volts constant from anywhere, and I'll show you where I'm going to do it, because that's what supplies this fuse, I believe, and also main power for the fuel pump relay that's on this harness. Okay, so we need a constant 12 volt source. Well, actually, this relay that was mounted right above the ECM is that exact thing. This yellow wire that's on here is a constant 12 volt source that feeds this relay. One side of this went to the ECU to supply 12 volts to it constantly. Oh wait, perfect. It's exactly what we need on this. This wire is going to go to that red wire that is on this. Okay, the other end of this yellow wire does go all the way across this harness, and it supplies constant 12 volt power, and it is on a fusible link from the original starter solenoid. That goes to the original starter solenoid. So I'm going to retain this relay because also the red and green wire that triggers this relay to turn on then supplies power to this red wire, which is going to be the ignition voltage to turn on the ECM to tell it that the ignition is on in run and start. And then what's cool is we also have a ground that comes off of this for this relay that also can be our ECM ground, because this runs all the way over to the ground that was over by the starter solenoid also. I'm also going to splice an extra little ground in it that goes next to the ECU, just so I have a redundant ground there. So I can use this relay and its wires again to hook up a lot of these wires. Okay, now next to the factory ECU connector, you had that 8-pin green connector. Honestly, I cut off almost all of those wires. I'm actually going to end up getting rid of them. The only two wires that I think we need out of this whole connector are going to be one of these two green wires with the yellow stripe. They both go to the same terminal actually, because that's what's basically going to give power from your fuel pump from the green wire that's on the Holley. So that's cool, they're both green. And then I left this purple wire connected because that's going to go to the switches and stuff for all of our AC stuff. So this purple wire is basically the turn on from the AC control head through this connector to be able to get out to the AC compressor. Then it runs through a series of switches, pressure switches, and this shut-off relay and everything. So I need to get this stuff picked out of the harness also. Okay, so I'm going to try to make all this make sense, but Holley has an injector harness that comes with the system, right? And Ford also had a similar harness, and I had to pick out the wiring for the oil pressure sensor and the coolant temp sensor for the gauges, because we still want those to work. These are going to have to run alongside of the bank 2, which would be cylinders 5 through 8, those right there. So this is going to have to get paired up with this. I'll put some conduit around it and make it look a little nicer and everything. But also, in the Holley system, I am going to have my manifold air temperature connection go with that, which is one of them on here. Is it this one? Yeah, manifold air temp right there. So this is going to have to run with that. And once I lay it out on the car and everything, you'll see what I'm talking about. But the rest of the wiring here, this mess that I have on the floor, that is the rest of this wiring. Now this is the plug right here that was from under the brake booster, near the brake booster. Now this is the plug that is going to give us a couple of signals that we're going to end up needing. So we have coolant temp and oil pressure, our ignition voltage, and our tachometer signal. The other wires, so there's 8 wires in here. I think about 4 of them are going to go away. We're not going to need them. So I'll have to figure out which ones those are once I thin it out a little bit further. I'm pretty close on that. Once I start laying this all out in the engine bay, it'll all make a lot more sense. Right now it's all in a pile and it's kind of hard to decipher it all. But I got it all figured out. This is about all you really need from the original harness, but you do have to take it apart. If you have done this, and you're kind of wondering why I'm doing it this way, it's a fair question. I mean, I could have just put it together but then we wouldn't have had a functioning dashboard or AC system and everything like that, or airbags. So yeah, if you're paying somebody to do this and not doing it yourself, this is why the labor is so high. I don't know what everybody else pays for something like this, but I figured I was going to be in for at least, probably 6 or 7 hours of labor in order to just install this. And honestly, I think I'm in even more than that, because if you've ever had to take apart an old wiring harness and cut off all that tape and all the conduit and everything, it sucks. That job really does suck to do. But yeah, I mean, it's not, I know you buy a kit and it comes with a harness and it seems like it should be as easy as just throwing it in there. Unfortunately, it's a lot more complicated than that. Even though, the EFI system manufacturer tries to make it seem like it's a real easy, just plug and play thing. Unfortunately, it is a lot more complicated. There's another company that makes a plug-in adapter to use the factory harness. The only problem is if you're using the whole rest of the harness, I mean, we had that bad ground. I mean, that ground wire could have caused a lot of problems too. The old harness, the thing's 30-some years old at this point. Was it 33 years old for this car? So it is nice to have a brand new harness for that part, but we're still using the old harness for some of the other stuff. And a lot of that wiring is still good. So I'm going to get this stuff kind of laid out, and then I can get it all wrapped back up and everything once I kind of get it all laid out on the vehicle. And then I'll know where everything exactly is going to go, and I'll get it all reconduited and integrated into that harness. So here I go. Okay, so since this is the Ford TFI connector, right, and this is the adapter harness, and on one end you have this that goes to the Holley EFI harness, and this goes to the distributor. It only has 4 wires of the 8 terminated in this because the Holley harness has like cam sensor and stuff like that all in that ignition harness. Well, there's no cam sensor on this engine. So the Holley, the harness side of things on the engine harness side does have all 10 of the pins occupied, whereas this only has 4 of them. But what drives me nuts is this wire that hangs off right here. This wire is what we're supposed to connect to the ignition coil to fire the ignition coil. But if you hooked up this to the harness and then spliced this into the coil, well, first off, it's going to have, you're not going to be able to disconnect it, right? Because it's going to be spliced. So what I want to do is I want to utilize some of these unused pins. I actually have a few terminals for these connectors that Holley uses. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put a terminal on the end of this, and I'm going to put it in terminal F, which is actually a cam sensor input. And on the other end of the harness, I'm going to cut it, and that's the one I'm splicing to the ignition coil wire. I won't have an extra connector in there, and I won't just have wires that are spliced around connectors and everything, because I don't want that. So the problem is they put this on the outside of the conduit. I'm going to have to cut the tape, or maybe I can, I don't think I can quite, well, yeah, I can slide it in there. So I just pulled that conduit back a little bit. I'm going to slide this wire in there. Find where I can make it poke out through here. There it is. I'm going to pull it through. And it'll make this just look a lot nicer. There we go. And I'm going to, luckily they made it about the right length. I'm going to put a terminal on the end of this, and I'm going to pin it into terminal F of this. Holley's directions are to take the factory firewall grommet and to cut it and reuse it on this harness. Now, the hole in this grommet's fairly small, and you do have to fit a couple, the main harness, and you have to fit the power wire and ground that goes to the battery through there. So either you cut the hole bigger, which is possible, but it's a lot of rubber to be cutting and stuff. I don't know. I'm not a big fan of this grommet. I mean, it works all right if you do it this way, but I'm going to try to make my own grommet with a 3D printer. So I just need to go measure this, and I'm going to make one that's got a little bit bigger hole in it than this, versus having to try to take a razor blade and potentially cutting myself with it. So I'm going to try to print one out of TPU and see how this turns out. I don't know. It may suck. I don't know. I'm going to give it a shot. Never really printed much with TPU, but I guess we'll see how this turns out once I peel all the supports off. It's kind of satisfying. Oh, wow, that worked out really well. So there's all the support. Throw away. Honestly, I think if I would have printed it upside down, maybe it would have not required quite this much support. And then somehow I got to dig this out. I probably need to use a pocket screwdriver. All right, so here's my new firewall grommet. When I printed it, I made a slice in it and everything, so it's got a, so it can actually move a little bit more, and I can get wires through there easier without having to try to pass all the connectors through the hole, right? So you need the grommet to be split to be able to fit the harness in. All right, the question is, does it fit in that hole back there? And does my grommet actually fit in? Oh yeah, money! Look at that. Dang. I mean, it only took 4 hours to print the sucker, but man, that fits good. Okay, as long as the wiring harness fits in there. I never thought in a million years it was going to fit that good the first time. But hell yeah. All right. There is a difference in the style of connectors between your air charge temperature sensor and your coolant temperature sensor. So with the Holley kit, it comes with both of these two sensors in order to install. They're both very similar. The one that is totally encapsulated here with brass is your coolant temp sensor, and it's going to go right here on this heater pipe. All right. I still think it should be the one that's over here, but that's for the gauge, the one that's down there. And then this one right here is the air charge temperature sensor, which is going to go right here in the intake. So that's why it's a little bit easier just to pull the upper intake, because it's easier to get to the injector connectors and everything. You can, some aftermarket intakes, snake your hands in there and all that, but to get to some of these, it's easier just to pop that upper intake off and then install them. So this one's going to go right here in the intake, and this one's going to go up here in the heater hose. All right, the socket size on the old sensors is about 1 inch, and on the new ones is 3/4 of an inch, or 19 millimeters. So here you can see similar sensors, same idea, difference in connectors. The old school Ford connector, and this one is a GM Metropack style connector. So all these Holley kits come with GM sensors for the most part. Now, if you don't force this one all the way down. Same thing with this. These are tapered pipe thread. So therefore, once they're seated down, they're seated down. You don't have to force it all the way down, or else you're going to end up cracking the intake or cracking this pipe. So speaking of sensors, if you're not running any boost, you can run the map sensor, the 1-bar map sensor that's internal to the Holley EFI module. However, this one right here has a supercharger on it, a Vortex supercharger, so therefore we need to step up to a 2 or even 3-bar map sensor. So I got a 3-bar map sensor coming that matches the connector that's already on the harness. And I'm going to mount it right here where the factory baro sensor is. An important thing with this Holley system is that you need to connect the main power harness to the actual battery itself. And these old Ford terminals are almost always damaged. So every single one of these that I've had to do on a Ford has had damaged terminals. Like this thing right here has been overstretched and it's crushed, and I don't necessarily feel great about this specific connection. This is at the negative. So I was going to replace this with a different terminal, and I went and got these marine ones, because I can also just screw on the Holley to this and chop off this and splice it onto a new end that will connect to this also. I'm going to do the same for the positive, so the positive and negative had good connections. Well, in order to make these battery cables, the people over at iCrimp, right, which is also iWis, I will put a link to their website and everything. They donated these tools to me in order to use them. And this one is another one that I picked up. And this is actually a battery cable crimper. So this right here will crimp ends onto battery cables, and it comes with a variety of sizes, different size eyelets. You can go big ones, small ones. So based on different sizes of the studs, right? So this where it connects right there, that looks like it's going to be about right. That is a 3/8, and I can fit only about a 6 gauge, but I can get different gauges into different sizes, and it comes with an assortment. What else does it come with? Comes with some heat shrink right here. This is kind of nice, because whenever you start making these cables separating positive and negative, red and black, you know, you don't want to get those mixed up. So they give you a couple different heat shrink colors and everything in a little bag. Another thing, they also give you the battery cable cutter in this kit. So this cable cutter is going to be really nice, because if you've ever had to try to cut through a thick battery cable with just a normal pair of side cutters, then it gets pretty tough. Also, the wire stripper right here. So this is a little razor blade inside of a wire stripper to strip those cables, because it's kind of a pain in the butt to take a razor blade, and a little dangerous, honestly, to go around it without a tool like this. And then you also have the crimper right here, and this will make a nice little crimp on our cables, and I'll show you how to use it. If you want to hit up iCrimp or iWis, I will put a link to the website in the description. And also, if you use promo code PETE5, you can get 5% off of these tools, which honestly, these tools are a pretty good deal anyway, and the quality of them is pretty solid. And you can adjust the different sizes and gauge of wire and everything right here for the crimp at the top. So, and right here you can adjust how hard they crimp with the pressure and everything, but I left it at the default of 1. So this is my first time using it. Let's just see how it goes. All right, we're going to use the cutters that come in this kit. I cut it as close to the original terminal as I can. Well, that's nice. All right, now this does have, on the ground side, it does have 2 different cables, basically. The one that goes to the body ground, and then the one that goes over to the engine. I need to make sure I put those 2 together. Before I strip the wire, I'm going to go ahead and put the heat shrink on there because it makes it easier to get heat shrink on before you strip the wiring. And we'll go ahead and put that in and rotate it in the correct direction. Pretty easy to do. And you know what, maybe the smaller spot right there is going to work for this. Yep, perfect. Okay, and then I'll just crimp those into the terminal that comes with the kit. Okay, now the ground side of these terminals actually is a smaller stud. So the 3/8 stud is actually just a little bit too big. So let me go with the smaller one, the 5/16. So 5/16, boom, that's going to fit that perfectly. And let's see, this is set up for 4-gauge wire on this one. It might be a little, nope, it's perfect size. Get both of those wires tucked in there. Okay. Now, the little arrows right here are pointing to whatever gauge that we're trying to crimp, and the terminal actually has numbers on it. So right here, this one right here says 6 by 3/8. So it's saying that hole right there is 6 gauge for the crimp, and that's 3/8 is what that hole is. The one I used on this actually reads 4 gauge and is a 5/16 hole. So therefore, I need to switch these over to the 4 gauge. There's a little arrow right there. Right now, they're set up for the 1 or 0 gauge. So I'm going to open those up, and I'm going to spin that to where it's aimed at 4. All right, so now this should be set up to crimp a 4 gauge crimp. And you can get a lot of leverage on these crimpers. Set in there and let it rip. Give it a tug and make sure it's not going to go anywhere. Cool. And that has crimped that pretty nicely. And I'm going to go ahead and put some heat shrink on it. I don't know why, but it's always satisfying to watch heat shrink. All right, here's my negative cable right there. Now I just got to make my positive one. Okay, now this Fox body, it doesn't even have a red cable or anything to denote that it's a positive, but you know, the red heat shrink will probably help us be able to identify that a little bit better. Now let's make sure I got the right gauge wire. I might be able to go a little smaller. That's 4 gauge. Maybe I can go with 6 gauge. All right, so that's the nice thing about this kit is it's got all different gauges of wiring here. So this 8 gauge is just a little too small. The 6 gauge, boom, is just right for that size of battery cable right there. So I will do that one in 6 gauge and we'll crimp it down. Again, all you got to do is flip this over to 6. It's pretty simple. And this might be easier if I actually just preload this thing in the crimper. All right, it's already preloaded in the crimper right there. Slide it on. Easy peasy. So now I can use these battery cables and connect to them like that. And I can connect the Holley to that. So therefore, we'll have a good solid connection at the battery. That's a lot easier to remove than if we were trying to put the Holley terminals through these bolts. And you can get these tools and a 5% discount on an already pretty good price on iwis.com. And make sure you use promo code PETE5. For the fuel pressure sensor, I bought one from Low Dollar Motorsports. It's a little over half the price of what the Holley one is. And they give you data to be able to put into the Holley system. And typically this will screw on with an adapter to the fuel pressure Schrader valve on the fuel line. The only problem with this kit is we have the supercharger, and the inlet to the supercharger is right. It is right where that where the sensor would go. However, this vehicle already does have a BBK fuel pressure regulator on here, and it had a mechanical gauge. These things are almost useless because you can't read the gauge while you're actually driving the car. Instead, I'm going to screw in the Low Dollar Motorsports fuel pressure gauge or fuel pressure sensor into the fuel pressure regulator. So therefore, we will now have a fuel pressure reading that we can have in the Holley. So you can either put it in an aftermarket fuel pressure regulator or in the factory fuel Schrader valve spot. But this is going to work out really well for us because it's not going to interfere, I don't think. So I got the harness laid out on the engine right here, just kind of laid out so I can see where things are going to be. And you're going to want this big branch where everything kind of branches off to be somewhere around the back of your intake, because that's where your injector harness comes off. That connector right there for the injectors is going to have to plug into this sub harness right here that goes to all your fuel injectors. I already have it sitting on this engine and it's plugged into all 8 of the fuel injectors. And so that's going to have to be sitting back here at the back of the engine. It's going to plug in right there. So that kind of has to go right there. So you're going to want that branch right there. Now, here's the deal is this little sub harness for the fuel injectors, it's kind of its own thing. However, we do still have another harness, which is our ignition harness that goes to our distributor. I've already incorporated the circuit into the connector for the coil negative control, which I'm going to have to break out into a harness with another little connector. But also we have a couple other things on this side of the engine that we need to address. which is our coolant temp sensor and oil pressure sensor. So I'm going to incorporate those two wires also into this harness to where it branches out with another little connector, just to make it a little bit easier to disassemble, just disconnect stuff whenever any kind of work needs to be done. Also, our manifold air temperature sensor is right there, but that's not on this harness. It's actually on this main harness. So let's see, manifold air temp, nope. See, there's just a bunch of these wires that branch off. And one of them, that's TPS. There it is, manifold air temp right here. So this one also comes down there and connects. So you're going to end up having a few different kind of harnesses connected over here on this side. And I don't really care for that. I think I'm going to try to incorporate them all into the same, maybe into this big one right here for the ignition. It'll be really nice if it just is all kind of incorporated into one, and it'll really clean up. Even though all this is kind of hidden by that intake manifold, I just don't like having like 5 different bundles of wire right there. It kind of defeats the whole purpose of all this. Another one that kind of gets me about this Ford kit from Holley is right here. This little branch has coolant temp sensor and oil pressure. Well, on the Ford, since this is supposed to be a Fox Body specific kit, our coolant temp sensor is over here. And in the same branch, you have oil pressure. Well, that doesn't make any sense, because if you did run an oil pressure sensor, it's all the way down here on the driver's side, down by the filter. That won't even reach anyway. So, not a huge fan of that. Now, you could swap the wire for oil pressure and fuel pressure signal wire at the ECM connector, and this then would plug into our fuel pressure sensor back there. We could do that, or, I mean, I've got my fuel pressure sensor wiring right here, which is actually fairly long. That would go into my fuel pressure sensor back here on the regulator, which is what I'm going to end up doing, but I actually might end up shortening all 3 of those wires, because this is way too long for right there. Now, they don't know where you're going to put that fuel pressure sensor, so they give you a lot of extra wiring. I just don't want to have to bundle it up, because it won't look nearly as nice. So that's going to end up going over here to our fuel pressure sensor. So that's going to stay on that side. The injector connector, right, your ignition connectors also up here. Manifold air temp was going to come around to this side. My IAC, that one over here, is going to be way over here, also way too long, so I'm going to end up having to shorten it, but I am going to switch a couple of the wires around. Yeah, so whew, there's a lot going on here. Another thing, throttle position sensor connector. I am going to take, I'm not going to use these that they gave me, just because I don't want, if he gets stranded on the side of the road, he needs to be able to just buy a throttle position sensor that plugs in. So I'm going to swap the connector on the harness side, not the throttle position sensor side, so you can just buy one for a Ford Mustang and it'll just bolt right in. Okay, you got your map sensor connector. That one's actually going to be about perfect, because I mounted the map sensor right there for our 3-bar map. Boom, that's just going to plug in right there in place of the factory map sensor. And then we have our wideband O2 sensor connector. Yep, wideband O2. That's going to run down the top of the transmission down to the exhaust. The other thing we need is this other harness. This is the main power harness for the Holley, and it runs all the way over here to the battery. So this one's going to run over to the battery, and I have to terminate the ends of that. Obviously, they gave us quite a bit of length of wiring. I don't know, it's got to go underneath the seat, so we might need all that length. We'll have to see. But the nice thing is this harness actually has, it's only got 2 wires in it right now, and it's a pretty good size piece of nylon split loom. So therefore, a lot of these other wires that we have to run from one side of the car to the other, we can put them into this harness and then just put a connector in it, and it'll make that nice. So we can clean up that wiring. So at the firewall, there should only be a couple harnesses ran together. So as a lot of these projects start snowballing, when you're doing an EFI system, part of it is all the inputs and outputs that you can control with a computer. The Terminator X has 4 inputs and 4 outputs. And I was talking to the owner of the car, and I think we're going to use a couple of the outputs for electric fans. So he said he did have a Mishimoto electric fan setup with the 2 fans. And I was like, yeah, I mean, that's perfect. We can utilize the outputs on the Holley to control a low and high speed fan setup. So I do have a 3 relay fan setup coming. So yeah, this it's snowballed a little bit, so I need to get this fan shroud off, get the original, well, it's not even a clutch fan, it's got a flex fan on it. That'll actually free up a little bit of high RPM power, not having to power that flex fan. Lucky for me, somebody cut the bottom out of the fan shroud previously, so that sure made it easy to get around the fan. I will have to transfer this overflow tank over to the Mishimoto fan shroud. Yeah, so this has one of those kind of flex fans, but, you know, at wide open throttle, that thing's still having to move a lot of air and everything. I mean, that's just going to cause a little bit of drag. For the throttle position sensor, the Ford throttle position sensor has a little harness that comes off of it. Holley wants you to add the correct connector to the Ford TPS to match what's on the harness. I am not a big fan of that, because if we have a failure of the throttle position sensor, you can't just go buy one that has a Ford throttle position sensor with a GM end on the connector. So I think we're better off taking the original throttle position sensor connector off the original harness and splicing it onto the Holley harness. So that's what I'm going to do for that. I am not going to modify this one right here on the Ford throttle or throttle position sensor. However, what I am going to modify is this Ford idle air control. So the Ford idle air control is only 2 pins, and it's pulse width modulated. The Holley struggles with, I guess, the frequency that's supposed to be pulsed at. So I personally haven't had that good of luck trying to get that tuned in right. What I have had good luck with is swapping this out with a GM style idle air control. Now, GM never made an idle air control that fits this intake style right there. However, Ford must have thought on the Ford Fiesta that the GM idle air control strategy was maybe better. I don't know. So they actually took a General Motors style stepper motor IAC, and they had a special mounting flange designed to utilize the GM style stepper motor that will bolt right there onto a Ford style intake. Now, I believe this is off a 2013 Ford Fiesta, and I will put a link to it. I got this as a kit. It is an aftermarket, actual stepper motor, but you can then find these stepper motors for other vehicles that cross-reference to it. But what I was after was this plastic adapter piece right there. So that's kind of nice. The kit I got, I believe, maybe we had to order the connector separate. So I ordered a connector, and it came, and the other one came with the IAC and the gasket. So that's easy enough of a swap. Now I do have to swap around some pins on the Holley harness, but it's just taking 4 of the pins and repurposing the original 2 for the Ford IAC and then changing 2 additional ones. So just make sure the holes line up. And we can bolt up the IAC. Okay, this right here is the ignition harness that runs to that TFI module. Now I did add the two wires for the coolant temp and the oil pressure sender to this circuit. However, I don't have the pins correct in the terminal to add it to this. Plus I got to break it out to run over to the red connector right here that runs over by the brake booster. So I'm going to add another connector to this, but adding a connector versus just solidly splicing this in allows me to still be able to remove the harness for any service. So what I'm going to use are Deutsch style connectors. These right here are a little bit more affordable than it is for a traditional weather pack style connector, but the kit that I got from iCrimp does have both weather pack and Deutsch style terminal tools in it. So that's what I'm going to use. Now I did buy a kit that comes with everything from 2 terminal connectors right here to, what do we got, 12 terminal connectors, I believe. Yeah, I think it goes up, there's a 12 terminal male and female connector in here. Now for this particular one, I am going to do a 4 terminal connector. So I'm going to cut these back to where it's about even with that. I'm probably just going to cut it about right there. And I'm going to splice some terminals onto that with this tool. All right, so I'm going to cut these wires about right there. And I'm going to strip just a little bit off of them. It doesn't need to be very much, just enough for the terminal to grab a hold of. You can see just a little bit stripped off right there. Make sure that's tight on there. And crimp around the wire. So now all I got to do is add them to the cavities. I'm going to put the one that's white in number 1. It should snap in. All right, clipped in. Stick this one on the other. Okay, those clipped in. Okay, so here is our electric fan setup. It is from Mishimoto. Both of these fans are the same size, so I'm going to use a 3 relay setup to control them. I am waiting for the connector to come in, but I can pull those up and I can do that even after I have the fans mounted. Now, this vehicle already did have a coolant overflow container on the factory shroud. This is already aftermarket, so I bolted it up to this fan shroud. It should fit pretty nicely. And it does have provisions to mount to this aftermarket radiator on the top and bottom, and it came with hardware. So this should just slide in. So a big part of an aftermarket fuel injection system is now we can run electric fans on a vehicle that originally had a mechanical fan. Kind of cleans up this area right here. You don't need that huge fan shroud. Now that we have computer control of our fans, we don't have to run some hokey sensors that kick on and some aftermarket controllers. This is just, we are going to have complete control over our fans. And it looks pretty good there. I have peeled back even to the next, I guess, knuckle of the harness where it all branches out. So I have the part that I peeled back right there that goes to my 3 sensors that I need. But then I peeled back just a little bit more where there's a big old knuckle where our ignition harness and our 12 volt battery and fuel part is branched off. So I do need the white wire out of that. I'm going to move it up into the idle air control part. And then actually in the ignition branch that's right here, I do need one of the wires that's in there, which is, yeah, there it is, this tan with black stripe, because that wire is the one that I'm going to hook the connector side over to our ignition coil trigger, because I modified the harness over there where it comes off the TFI. But then I can repin that wire to the correct pin on the other connector and then extend it out to where it's the fourth wire for the IAC, because I needed to add two. So I'm going to use the white wire there and then the tan wire and extend it out. Now it's like, man, having splices in the harness, is that good? Well, I'd rather not have a splice in the harness, but if you look at the Holley harness where it comes to the original IAC connector, look at that. They actually have splices in there anyway. So, yeah, I mean, as long as you do a good splice, it should be good. I'm not going to use butt connectors. I do like to use solder and heat shrink and everything like that, and make sure it's sealed up. Also, the coolant temp sensor, I can run that wiring with all the others, with the throttle position sensor, the fuel pressure sensor, all that can go with that. So cool, get a little extra of this nylon sleeve and everything, because all this can run up there because it's all kind of going to the same place. So I really have about 4 different branches of this wiring that I'm going to combine into one, because they all run right next to each other. So that'll really clean up this harness versus having them just be a whole bunch of separate branches. Now I'm going to lay this up on the engine so I can get an idea of how long these wires need to be able to reach where they need to go, because I don't want to have to coil a bunch of wire up back there. So this big knuckle right here is going to be sitting right behind the intake, right? Because this right here is where our injectors plug in, and this is where our ignition plugs in. So this is all going to be behind the intake, so I can position that back there. And then I will be able to figure out how to route those wires. So I laid the harness out to where the big branch and the knuckle, as I keep calling it, is right here at the back of the intake. This connector right here will plug in right here to my fuel injectors, so I need that to be right there. The ignition harness connector right here, this big one, is going to plug into the ignition setup that's going to be just underneath the intake manifold on that side. So then all these wires that I just was messing with sitting over here on top of the intake are going to have to come over in this area right here, right? So this branch is coming over here. You can see the throttle position wiring is about perfect. All right, so on the Ford harness, they got the throttle position sensor wiring really close to what it needs to be, right? And it's going to plug into there. So I'm going to need to make the fuel pressure sensor, which is right there, that wiring. If you look, my fuel pressure wire, fuel pressure is way too long. So I need to make it also about the same length as that throttle position sensor. I still have my idle air control, which is this one. All right, my idle air control right here, which is actually, if I run it with those and just keep the length about right, because my idle air controller is under here, and I'll just run it underneath all that, I think that actually could be about the correct length as it is. So I just need to make all the wires about that same length. And then I still have my coolant temp, which is right here. The coolant temp sensor, that one breaks out, and it's going to have to run underneath the intake manifold with the fuel injectors. Okay, it's going to have plenty of reach. to get up there to our coolant temp sensor and plug in where it's at. So it is going to have to branch off for the coolant temp, but maybe I can make the IAC go with it. So I can put both of those together because the idle air control's over here. Make them branch and connect right around where this coolant temp sensor is. Okay, now on the original factory harness, the part that was on the lower intake manifold that has the salt and pepper shakers at the back, well, if you do it my way, you're going to need to get the throttle position sensor connector off of that. All right, I want to be able to just plug into to be able to buy a Ford throttle position sensor if we ever need it, instead of having to splice wires like the Holley setup wants you to do. They want you to splice a GM connector onto the Ford throttle position sensor, which is not the way I think I would want to do it. I would want to be able to buy a part off the shelf. And I'm going to cut it off the original Ford harness. Hopefully I can just slide that heat shrink off. Yep, there we go. Okay, so you're going to be left with 3 wires. You're going to be left with a, looks like brown and white, or maybe it's supposed to be black and white, a gray and white, and a gray and red wire. I'm going to match them up with the colors that are on the throttle position sensor. Because if we look at our Holley harness for our throttle position sensor, wherever it is, right here, the colors are black, green, and orange. If we look at the factory Ford throttle position sensor, what do you know? Black, green, and orange. But that's not the colors in the harness. So I do need to match up these colors. I swapped out the Holley connector for the Ford connector. Got my wires all matched up and everything, and even color-coded my heat shrink, so hopefully that'll be a nice little touch that you'll never be able to see. Fuel pressure sensor, I need to shorten that and put it at the same length pretty much as my throttle position sensor. These two sensors, I need to make the wiring the same length. All right, I'm not just going to cut and splice this, because I actually have a new connector for the fuel pressure sensor that I got from Low Dollar Motorsports. So I'm just going to trim the wiring back here and install the new terminals on that sensor. And then actually we can save this into this one of the pigtail. And then we'll even have an extra sensor connector if we need to add another sensor later on. All right, so I've said it before, we're swapping from a pulse width modulated solenoid that only requires 2 wires to a stepper motor that requires 4 wires. Now the wire colors here in terminal A is yellow, B is red, C is white, and D is black. Now I'm repurposing a couple of the wires that are in the harness here. The original 2 wires that went to the Ford IAC were red and yellow. So I connected the red and yellow wire to the red wire just to maintain the colors. And then the gray with green wire, I connected it actually to the yellow wire because I didn't have, none of the 4 of those were gray and green. So those are the 2 original wires that were for the idle air control, and those were actually located in connector B right here. So there's 2 connectors that go to the actual Holley ECU. Connector A is the big one, connector B is the smaller one, and you can see right here, here's my red and yellow wire that is in terminal 20 of this connector. I need to actually move it to terminal B9, which if we look at, I'll drop that. Let me see. If we look at the B connector from the back, there are 4 wires right here. Actually, this third one over here, this gray with green, is actually one of the wires I need to move. But I need to utilize these 4 terminals. You can see that. So these 4 terminals right here are for the IAC. I need to move this one that's in terminal 3 actually needs to move over to terminal 1. And then this one, that's the red one right there, needs to move to terminal 9, which is this bottom right one. And then the other 2 wires are actually over here in connector A. I need to do those. And right here on my sheet, I've kept track of what's what. And so the terminal that is in A6 needs to be, it's a white wire. That is our old points output wire, gets moved to B8 right there. And then the gray wire goes, it was in A20 and it moves over to B2, and it used to be an input for the oil pressure sensor. So how do I do this? I'll also start with this connector right here, and I'm going to pop out these plugs, and then we'll pop out these 2 wires and put them in their right spot, and then we'll take them out of this other side and move them also. Now, in the Holley connector, these are amp seal connectors, and you can see a little white tab right there, and there's a couple small ones on that side. You push on the one in the middle and it should click and it pops in. And at that point, I believe I can just pull these wires out. Yep, and they pull out really easily like that. It's kind of nice, actually, how easily that works. All right, so that red wire there needs to go to B9. And B9 has a plug in it. So I got to pick that plug out. Come on. There we go. I'm going to save that plug because I'm going to move it over to where that wire came out of. So we'll push it back into where that wire came out. I will plug that wire into B9. All right, it's in. Now this other wire that's in B3, it moves over to B1. So just pull it up and out. All right, that one needs to move over to B1. Come on, get up out of there. Now these plugs are held in pretty good because of the seal that's in there. Even on the ones that are plugged have seals in them to keep water intrusion out. Okay, move that over to there. And actually, let me pluck it out a little bit. Okay. Okay, it's all the way in and seated. Now I have to get the 2 wires out of this other side that I need, which look like they are in A6. So I got to do the same thing. Push the little lock and then find A6. And the nice thing is they're numbered on the back side of this connector. A6 was that white wire. There it is. Boom, there's my wire from A6. And it goes to B8 over here on this one. So there's that plug. Where's my A6? Okay, A6 moves over to B8. Okay, and then make sure they're seated all the way right there. And then I'll put my plug back in A6. Oops. Take the plug, put it in A6. Okay, and then A20 goes to B2. So where's A20? Oh, that one's going to be a fun one to find. It's stashed in the middle. And A18 is there, 1920, there it is. Pick out A20, pull it out. All right. And then let me take the last plug out of here and put it in A20, and I can lock that connector down. So find A20, plug it. I know my hands are in the way, but it's all small, tedious work. Okay, and then to lock this connector back down, make sure all the terminals are all the way seated. You can see them through there, and we just push this back. And it locks into place. Okay. All right, and then this one goes into B2. Okay, you gotta make sure it's all the way seated. And if it's not all the way seated, I don't think that little white lock will go all the way in. Okay, then lock it down. Boom. All right, so my idle air control has been rearranged and it should work correctly once I select it properly in the Holley EFI as a GM style IAC or stepper motor IAC. So it's no longer set up for a pulse width modulated IAC. But the important thing is making sure you keep track of what wires go to what and where they were, where they need to go. Okay, one thing here, if you are doing the idle air control where you run the stepper motor, you do need to pay attention to the way that Holley says to wire it versus if you're using an actual GM or this Ford Fiesta or Festiva, whatever this thing is, idle air control. Terminals A and C may need to be reversed. So what I had to do was go in and set my base rest point for the idle air control. I could run it. I unbolted this and I ran it all the way up to 100% and all the way down to 0. And you should be able to see this idle air control pintle move inside of here. If it doesn't, then something's not wired right. I was really fighting trying to get the idle right. And the whole time was the idle air control was intermittently kind of moving and kind of not moving. And the Holley kind of freaks out because it thinks it's moving because it doesn't know that it's not moving. So then it also adjusts timing, the ignition timing, thinking that this is working, and then it gets thrown in a tizzy and it really kind of messes with that and everything. So definitely make sure that the idle air control actually works. If you run that that base set point of the IAC at rest and everything up and down, or the idle speed up and down, it should change. If it doesn't change, then you need to make sure that that's working properly. Okay, so I'll pass this through the firewall. Now the question is, how do I want to run this? Do I want to run it up and over all this AC stuff along this pinch weld up here, which does look like a good spot? I don't necessarily want it dangling all down there on the back of the engine. So I think I'm going to kind of hug the top of the firewall up here. And you got to watch out for this little vacuum check valve. Don't want to snap it off. And I'll pass this through the hole in the firewall over here. There. Now on a Fox body, where this grommet goes through the firewall is almost behind the HVAC case. So you got to be kind of careful trying to get that through there. I'm going to pop that vacuum line off. Hopefully I don't break it. There we go. I also have to get this relay, which if I take it off of there, probably make it easier to fit through there. considering it's hard to even get to the hole in the firewall from the inside. All right, so I do have this running through the firewall. I have this other harness for the airbag lines, or the airbag wires, but actually I'm going to pull that back through and add the fan output wires to that. And also I believe this AC relay right there is going to also have to be connected over this way, so therefore it's going to need to go through that. I think I'm going to have to remake my firewall grommet a little bit bigger. So when we pull these wires through, you can see this harness. All right, it's going to run alongside of this door sill plate right there, because I do need to take the seat loose so I can mount the ECU underneath the seat. So this harness goes something like this underneath the seat. And then all this other junk that's hanging down, that's where we connect our, see, we got our inputs and output connector right there. So that can go for the fan outputs and our inputs from the AC relay, all that. Which I still got to run through the firewall. And here's where we're going to connect this red wire right here. Their 12-volt switch is going to go to the factory relay that used to sit up on top of the ECM up there. The ground is going to connect to this original ECM ground, which is, it was right down here on the body. And the green wire is the fuel pump, and the fuel pump connects to this green connector right there. And I believe it's this, yeah, green and yellow wire is the fuel pump wire. So I'm going to use the original green connector and then make it go over to that harness. Okay, so now that I got my harness back here, right about where I was hoping it would end up, and I can start branching out some of these wires. Now, the first one branch that we come to is the wideband, which is going to run down on top of the transmission, and it's going to connect to an oxygen sensor that we put into the exhaust. So I will run that one down there. Now, I don't recommend messing with these wires too much, so and it might be a little bit long. Okay, then we have our injector connector, which is going to connect to our injector harness right back here. Easy peasy. We have our ignition harness, which I still need to make a connection on the wiring that goes over to the ignition coil to trigger it. That stuff. And the AC line kind of gets in the way, that suction hose. All right, we have manifold air temp, which needs to run underneath the intake over to here. There we go, up under the intake. Ooh, that one's barely long enough. Okay, that is connected. Here's my ignition harness. Then I also added the couple wires that go for the gauges. That's going to go to the back there. I still need to hook up the ignition wire to that other harness. All right, so this right here, this is my IAC and my coolant temp sensor that goes over here, but I'm going to run under the front of the intake. So this will have to run under the throttle body. Alright, coming up right there for our coolant temp and idle air control. And let's see, throttle position right here. And also fuel pressure, since I got that sensor mounted in the regulator right next to the throttle position sensor. Let's see, one last connection over here, I believe is my map sensor, and that's that green connector. Got my 3-bar GM map sensor right there that I mounted on the firewall. Okay, so if you are going to run an external map sensor like this one right here, this one is a GM 3-bar map sensor. I'm running into the problem it won't actually plug in. And that's because there's little notches right there. You see the 6 o'clock position of the middle pin, and at the 3 o'clock position on the far right pin, which is terminal A and B. So A is the one on the right, B is the one in the middle. And there is not corresponding notches in the connector right there. You can actually see where I was trying to plug it in, right where my thumbnail is, it's trying to put a little notch right there. So I need to make a little notch to match the sensor. And I'm going to use a little Dremel. Okay, now I'm going to get a pick and I'm going to kind of pick the junk out. We'll see if it plugs in. I got to make sure I get any of that melted plastic out of there. There we go. All right, it now plugs in. Now I can bolt it back up there where it goes, and we're in business. So all I did was took the factory bracket and I put a little notch in it and I drilled a couple holes and tapped them, and a couple 6x1 bolts screw right into my tapped and threaded holes. It doesn't take much torque to hold these down, so I didn't put a nut on the back side of them, just snug them up. Now, if you are running a 1-bar map sensor, well, or no boost, you can just run the vacuum line to the Holley ECU. But if you're running a 1-bar map sensor, I do think it plugs in directly. I think they put those notches in there so people didn't accidentally put a 3-bar map sensor in a 1-bar spot. So you may have to make that modification if you have boost. All right, under the car, we have the wideband sensor installed. And I'm just going to have to pull all this wiring. There's a lot of wiring that comes with this for the wideband. On the Fox Body, you don't need that much, but I'm not cutting those short. Plus, there's an adapter harness right there, so it makes it even longer. I'm just going to pull that up and kind of zip tie it up on top of the transmission. Is about all we can do. I am going to cut the wires off of this O2 sensor right here because it's not used and it just looks a little hokey, them dangling down. But I'm going to leave the sensor in there to plug the hole so we don't have a big exhaust leak. All right, so we got rid of the mechanical fan and I got some shorter bolts to fit the water pump pulley. And then we have the Mishimoto fans bolted up. I still got to put the bolts on the bottom. And I do need to still pin the connectors. Now the wiring harness that runs to it is going to run down to the bottom. And I need to put on these high current Deutsch style connectors because the fans don't have this weather pack style connector on it. And these are designed to actually plug in directly to a GM style fan from a GMT 800 truck. So like a 2005 to 2007 style electric fan on a Chevy truck. So we do need to re-terminate those with the different connectors on both ends right there. And that goes to an actual 3-relay setup that I have back here in the corner, tucked away, nice and neat. Now, I did have to pull the wiper motor just so I could get, holes drilled in there to be able to mount that. But that's kind of nice because it contains circuit breakers and all 3 relays. And these 2 wires that come off here come with a connector. Now, this was supposed to get pinned into a GM PCM, because that's what those terminals are right there. but I'm just going to splice these two wires to two of the output wires on the I/O harness, the input and output harness that is part of the Holley. So this right here is going to get run up with all this wiring. I am going to leave that connector in there just because it makes it nice and easy to disconnect, but I'm going to run it with that wiring, as is this wiring that's going to run over for the AC compressor, for the relay trigger wire to trigger the ECM's relay on, and I'm also going to have the gauges in part of that. So they're all going to get tucked into this harness right there, which this harness is the main power harness for the Holley. So I do have to put my terminals on there for power and ground so I can hook it up to the battery right there. And then once all that's tucked into this harness, it'll look nice and neat. The fans, since I wired up the fans and the relays, the wiring comes down to the bottom, and I have two Deutsch style connectors, and these are the high amp style that are known as DTP. So for the higher current stuff, I went with DTP style connectors, although I don't know if I necessarily needed them because the gauge of the wire on the fans really isn't that, it's not really that big for these Mishimoto. I would have expected a little bit bigger gauge wiring for the fans. All right, so if you have one of the old versions of the Terminator X, now this gentleman has owned this for a couple years now, so I don't think you can get this bracket. But the old version of the Terminator X Fox Body kit that they used to have came with this bracket to mount this setup under the seat. So I got the seat pulled back, and then find out this one is equipped with a factory amplifier, which I did not know that you could get Fox Body with a factory amplifier. As you can see, where the Holley's supposed to go is where the factory amplifier goes. So that is not going to work for me. Crap. So now I got to think of something else. So now it looks like where the factory ECU went down here is where I'm going to have to put the Holley. Now I do think I've ran across a couple of mounting plates that I have seen for the Terminator X on Thingiverse or something, or some 3D printing websites. So I think I'm going to go look to see if I can print a bracket to kind of hold the Terminator X in this area right there. It does kind of suck as far as how much of this extra wiring I'm going to have to deal with, but I'm going to have to maybe shorten my power lead because that one's way too long. So there's the spot where the factory ECU sits, and I want to mount this Terminator X one. There we go. Let's dim that down a little bit. This Terminator X module somewhere in this area. I don't want to just stuff it in here. I want it to, you know, it'll rattle around. I want it to actually be mounted. Now, you can actually fit a Dominator even up in here, which is a pretty good size ECU. But we're just Terminator X on this one, so it's quite a bit smaller ECU. I'm gonna see what kind of things I can print up and use. Okay, so I needed a way to mount the ECU because this one has a factory amplifier. I don't know at what point these Fox Bodies got an amplifier, and there's nothing in Holley's instructions about your car may possibly have one. So I looked for any free CAD files or anything like that to try to print a bracket. Everything I see to print is for just the screen, not necessarily for the ECU. So I kind of made myself something to put in the factory place, and here's what I came up with. There's a mounting hole right there and a mounting hole right up here for where the factory bracket is and everything, so that will kind of hold that in place. And I mean, I'm not going to lie. There was also one online you could buy, but I didn't have time to wait for it. Plus, I have a 3D printer, so I might as well try my hands at CAD and try to do something similar. Now, at the top, it's going to be very difficult to get up there whenever the ECM's in place to be able to put bolts in there. So I kind of copied this kind of feature, and it just snaps in place like that. And then at the bottom, I printed out threads in the hole and everything, and then I have 1/4 inch by 20 bolts by basically a 1/2 inch, and those will screw in and hold the bottom of this ECM to the bracket and everything. So I think this will work. And I don't know, I made it on Tinkercad, so I think those files are shared. I don't know, I might find some way to share the file. I don't know, it didn't take too long to come up with it, but yeah, just a nice little bracket that should hold that in place and be a nice little feature for this car. Okay, so here is the bracket that I printed up right here. It's down in the kick panel where the factory ECU is. Let me dim that a little bit. All right. And you can see way up there, there's a bolt. That was the fun one to try to get off whenever the factory bracket was in there. And the Holley is going to slide into those slots. And then a couple bolts are going to hold it to this right here. So the ECU just slides up in here. Okay, you can see I'm sliding the ECU up in the slots. And down here, we just put some bolts in right there. That'll hold it in. And then you can actually see the LEDs right here if you take the kick panel off, which might help you diagnose something if you need to. Okay, so the main power harness for the Holley, they give you quite a bit of wire there, but I think they're also expecting you to mount this underneath the seat. So since we're not doing that, I can shorten that quite a bit. Now, the conduit that goes around it is pretty good size, and the wiring for things like the gauges, the ignition coil, power and ground to the main relay, all that I'm keeping from the original harness is going to be tucked up into this wiring conduit right there that goes over to this, since it does come across the back there. So that'll clean that up quite a bit instead of having a separate harness. And then I can cut this shorter and terminate it for my power and ground to the Holley once I kind of figure out the rest of this. So this has to come around the back there. Right there, it's got my fan controls, right? So my input and output for my fan right there. Blue is high speed, green is low speed. And those are going to get pinned to the input and output harness on the Holley. So that goes to the inside of the car. So I'm going to follow or put this harness into that harness, into the conduit for the power wires and stuff. Just, it'll make it look so much better at the firewall instead of having 5 different bundles of wires coming through there. Here's my main positive that goes over to the starter solenoid, but then I have the Holley positive and everything. Now the Holley system does come with, for these cables, I did cut I cut quite a bit out. You know, this is probably almost 3 feet of that wiring that I didn't need. So I cut it out, made it shorter so I didn't have to bundle it all up somewhere else. And so now I'm going to terminate it right here to where it hooks up to our terminals for our Holley. Okay, so on the passenger side footwell here, it looks like quite a mess right now. Granted, a lot of this harness right here, all my input and outputs, I got, what, 2 of them, I think, to hook up still, 2 of the wires, and a bunch of the wires I'm just going to bundle up. So that'll all get kind of taken care of and out of the picture. All of this back here on this harness, this is the main power wire, the fuel pump, and the ground. Those are going to get shortened up quite a bit because let's see, the fuel pump has to go to the green wire on this green connector, and the power wire I need to connect to these wires right here, which I think I'm going to put a connector in there. The ground I'm just going to run to the original ECM ground that was right here at the behind the carpet. And I'm going to hook that also to the ground that goes on this main relay, which I got hanging down right there. So those grounds are going to go down there. Now, I think I can get this kind of a little bit more cleaned up by plugging in my ECM here and putting it in its spot, and then I can finish up the connectors after I do that. So I got my connectors that are already terminated here. Those should be able to plug into the ECU or ECM, whatever we want to call this thing. Electronic control unit or module. And the main power source right here to the Holley. And I should be able to just slide it up into its spot, assuming my mount works out the way I'm hoping. All right, at this point, I've got everything kind of tucked away up in here in this little pocket. I do have my green wire and my purple wire connected to this green connector. The purple wire goes out to the AC. The green wire is from my fuel pump relay on the Holley harness. I still have to connect my power and ground. I'm saving that for last because I want to get all this other out of the way, because this input-output harness has 8 wires on it. We're going to be using 4 of them. I already connected the 2 outputs outside for the fan relay control. Now I have these other 2 wires that are in that same harness. This black wire, which is the AC signal input, and this is the AC relay, the wide open throttle relay output. So I'm going to make those about the same length since they come through the same harness as these others. And let's see, my AC shutdown output wire is the gray with black. So the gray wires are your output wires on this harness, by the way. So the AC shutdown relay is this long wire right there. So I just need to pull it, make it about the same length as this one. Leave a little bit because I got to splice these together or solder them together. Okay. And it seems like when you start pulling some of this wire out of here, it makes it a lot more manageable than having just a big thing of spaghetti all over the place. Got a piece of heat shrink. So that wire goes to right there. And I'll splice these together. If you don't have one of these pistol grip wire strippers, you're missing out. It makes it real easy. Plus, it kind of strips it back just a little bit, and then you can pull the rest off. So you can kind of leave it, and the strands don't go fraying everywhere until you're ready to pull them off. So it's kind of nice, especially if you're like pre-terminating a harness or something like that. I'm going to put a link to some of the tools that I've used to see if they, will help you out or anything, or if you have any suggestions on any tools that maybe I don't know about. Leave a comment and let me know your favorite wiring tools. As I'm sure a video about wiring is insanely boring unless you're doing a Holley install yourself. Then it might be right up your alley and pretty informative. All right, one more, and the AC input is this black wire that I got right here. And that signals to the Holley that the AC is on. And why would we need that? Well, we would need that to know to either kick up the idle a little bit, or also we want to kick on the fans. So we're going to use that input to kick on the electric fans because we installed electric fans. And that is the white with blue wire right here. And that will get around to that. So pull that tight, leave just a little bit extra. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up this harness for the input-output harness, and it just plugs in right there. But I still have all this extra wire because I have 3 inputs and 1 output that I didn't use. Now the question is, do I just wrap it all up, zip tie it out of the way, because it is going to be hidden behind there, but that also takes up some real estate, or do I just depin it out of there and then save the wires for later somewhere else to where it's not all in there? I think I'm going to depin those terminals out of this connector just because it'll clean it up, and I mean there's wires everywhere under here, so whatever I can do to kind of minimize that. All right, so I took a bunch of the wiring out of that connector, made it a little bit thinner, put a little extra of the nylon split loom around it. That'll be a lot nicer than having all those extra wires bundled up inside there. So boom, now my outputs and input and output harness is connected. And I'll tuck that up in there. I want to make sure this little part right here, the can, it says can on it, this part needs to be accessible. This is where we hook our USB cable or the digital dash, or the Holley little 3.5-inch screen to, so that needs to be accessible. Now all I got is powers and grounds, and then I got to make sure I connect all the other harnesses that I had to disconnect earlier when I originally took out the original factory ECU. All right, so I got all the connectors reconnected under here. Got my airbag harness connector. I think this leads to probably to power to the doors and windows, and then you got your fuel pump and your AC connector right there. Got my CAN connector here, so I can either plug in the Holley 3.5-inch screen or a Holley USB cable to be able to tune it with the laptop software, which is the best way to go. All right, and with the Terminator X, you get this little 3.5-inch screen that plugs into that CAN connector. Now this right here is nice to use as like a dash gauge and everything, and it does have some tuning capabilities, and I know some people just use this. However, it is limited in its functionality. You do have to pay, I think it's $50 for the Holley USB cable that plugs into the same connector. Now this right here will open up a whole nother world of tuning. And honestly, the computer side of the software is the best part of this whole Terminator, any Holley EFI system. So do yourself a favor, spend the extra $50 on this CAN harness because it's amazing what you can do. Also, changing any inputs and outputs, all that sort of stuff, I think you have to do through the computer software. So to really utilize what this Holley can do, you need that. All right, here we go. Startup attempt. Now that I got all the parameters, I think, put into the Holley as I think I need to. Correct injector data, among other things. Correct map sensor and all the sensor data and everything, and all the actuators that we have and parameters set. Inputs and outputs, yada yada yada. All right, it starts and runs. I got all the gauges working. The thing starts and runs. And the tunability from the Holley is nice, having the, you know, the wideband that runs at wide open throttle and everything. I mean, this thing's putting out almost 10 psi of boost. The 3-bar map sensor's handling that just fine. I mean, a 2-bar probably would have been okay, but you know, if this guy wants to get crazy with it, he can throw a smaller pulley on that and crank it up a little bit more. There's always some room to grow. And we weren't quite sure what it was going to do. This thing's fast. I mean, it's a fun car. It's been a fun project. It kind of, you know, it definitely takes a while to do it the way that I do it, but it does make for a really nice, clean install. If you're doing any crimping of terminals, you need a good terminal crimper set, check out iWis. I will put a link down in the description, and you can use my promo code and everything and get 5% off. That would help the channel and everything. Thank you to those guys for sending me those tools. They seem to work pretty good. I got a nice good crimp on all my terminals and everything. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get this thing started up. Really hear that old vortex purring. That thing's got a scream to it. Anyways, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one. Man, listen to how that thing just sets right down on idle.